Just a quick heads up that this episode does cover themes including animal cruelty. So if you're not in the headspace to watch that today, feel free to flick through and we'll be back again next week.
The New South Wales greyhound racing industry is being investigated after a former employee of the racing body detailed allegations of cover-ups and abuse. In today's deep dive, we'll look at what the report says about the way greyhounds are treated in the sport and what the New South Wales Government plans to do next.
Harry, I must confess that you have been around the office talking about this story this week and that this is something I don't know a lot about. We're talking today about the greyhound industry. It's in the headlines, especially this week, but it's kind of been around for a little bit. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of the state of play when it comes to greyhound racing here in Australia?
So I was actually quite surprised to learn that Australia is just one of 7 countries that has greyhound racing. Not every country in the world has greyhounds. In some countries it is banned, and in some particular states it's banned. If you think of the US, for instance, some states have greyhound racing, some of them have outlawed it. And in Australia, we have it in every state and territory except the ACT. So greyhound racing is an industry that you could definitely say is fairly familiar with some controversies. And in particular, there have always been some concerns about animal welfare, about its association with the gambling industry, and some questions over whether racing bodies are being adequately regulated, that being that it's being overseen by an independent body and that it's following the rules.
This might be a really stupid question, and I know I'm not allowed to say that on here because we wrote a book that says
silly
opposite.
Question,
I know.
Zara.
When we talk about greyhound racing, we're talking about like what happens with horses in horse racing, but just with greyhounds, right?
With dogs.
Okay,
yes.
So we're talking about dog races.
We're talking about dog races.
Okay. I feel like the first time I saw it in the news was, I believe it was a Four Corners investigation that was done by the ABC. What was that investigation about? Was that kind of the first point at which all eyes were on the greyhound racing industry?
It was definitely the biggest scandal around greyhound racing, especially in the last decade or so, or the last 20 years. There's always been some murmurings about what has been happening in the industry, but I think that was one of these big moments where a lot of people's stomachs were churned by what they saw on TV. So this particular investigation by the ABC exposed what is known as live baiting in the industry. So this is where, and I do apologize because this is some pretty gruesome detail to go through, but it's basically where a live animal is used as bait for a greyhound to chase on the racetrack.
Why would that be a thing? Why would they be doing that in the first instance?
Well, it goes back to dogs and their just pure animalistic instinct, which is to chase down prey. And these prey in this particular circumstance is completely defenseless. It's just hanging off a rod that's being whirred around the track. And so they're encouraged to race after it, and they will maul that animal once they get to it. So that is against the rules. It's not allowed. Okay. And this particular expose in 2015 discovered that it was actually being used, and it was actually quite widespread as well. It wasn't just one outlandish track. Okay. It was multiple tracks right up and down the country.
Okay, and so that was exposed, you said, back in 2015. What happened? Were there any changes to the industry? If we're saying it was fairly widespread, did anything change?
So there were definitely some major consequences. Few officials and trainers were dismissed and banned from ever competing in greyhound racing again, or being involved in the industry, I should say. And there were a number of state reviews into the industry altogether. And this is where we come to New South Wales, because at the time it was led by a coalition government under former Premier Mike Baird, who actually passed a ban on greyhound racing in 2016. Yeah. And it was a pretty big move at the time. It was the first state to do so. Was that in response to what had happened? There had been a special commission of inquiry, so this big investigation, this big statewide review after the expose, and then the state decided to ban the industry altogether.
Mm-hmm. A ban was legislated here in New South Wales, but it's 8 years later and we're talking about greyhounds in New South Wales again. What's happened during that time?
The ban actually never came into place.
Okay.
So it had been legislated to start the following year, but within 3 months of that legislation passing, the government decided to overturn it.
So today, I can announce that the greyhound industry will be given that one last chance. It'll be given an opportunity to reform as it needs to.
Now, one of the areas of reform involved bringing in a new regulator, the Greyhound Welfare and Integrity Institute, and that was put in place to monitor animal welfare and to make sure the industry as a whole was complying with the new rules.
Okay, so there was this new body that was set up to regulate the industry and to make sure that the rules were being followed here in New South Wales. Is that what has happened?
Well, as far as we knew, there was compliance, there was more reporting, there was an annual report that would come out every year, and then we come to June this year. So there was a vet, his name was Dr. Alex Britton. He worked as the top veterinarian at the Greyhound Racing New South Wales, and he left his post in June. And when he quit, he put together a handover document, which is normally, I would think, a guide to what would the next person doing the role have to do. Can they log into the server and those kinds of things? But instead, he didn't really take it as a normal handover document.
Why? What did he do?
So he wrote a 54-page long analysis of what he thought were some areas of concern within the greyhound racing industry. So he included in this document some emails, photos, spreadsheets, you name it, he had it.
Wow.
Basically backing up some of his concerns about animal welfare, about this alleged cover-up that had been going on within the industry itself. And Dr. Britton, he was scathing. And there's a quote I pulled out from it that I think sums up his views. He said the greyhound racing body has been, quote, misrepresenting and obfuscating the facts.
Right, so some fairly severe language there. What exactly are his accusations? What has he said has happened here?
So he covered off many parts of the industry, but I think it's helpful to split his report into two key areas. So the first being dog injuries. Britton said current practices are putting dogs at higher risk of injury. So, for example, he pointed to the fact that some greyhound racing tracks are using hard clay. In places like the UK, it's pretty much all wet sand that the dogs are racing on, and that's better for their paws and avoids serious injuries. He also said the way that the New South Wales racing body pays greyhound owners is also adding to the increased risk of dog injuries because as it stands at the moment, trainers given $60 for every greyhound they bring to race day.
So is the logic then that people are trying to enter more greyhounds into races because they'll be paid more?
Exactly. So that's what Britain's saying. There's an incentive. They're being goaded into bringing as many dogs as possible, and that has led to an increased risk of injury. So that could be that there's just more of a chance of a dog being hurt when they're racing, or trainers might be racing animals that just aren't fit to do so.
This man's role was as a vet for Greyhound Racing New South Wales. So presumably he had a role in protecting these animals to some degree. What are the rules around the health of greyhounds? What was his role meant to be?
So when it comes to Britton's role specifically as a vet, he noted that vets are there on race day under the new rules, and they need to inspect the well-being of the racing dogs. But he said that in some cases, vets are only given 45 minutes to inspect as many as 100 to 120 dogs at a time. So he calculated that to be about 30 seconds per dog. And it makes it, he said, pretty much impossible for them to fully undergo a health assessment of each greyhound before they race. And also in New South Wales, greyhounds are allowed to race every second day. And Britton points out that in Queensland and Western Australia, the rules require dogs only race no more than twice a week to recover between those races.
What else did he say about the conditions of these dogs?
He included some photos of kennels in Western Sydney, which are used to hold some of the dogs before the races. And these images showed blood smeared on the floor of some small kennels with what he said were rotten and rusted cages. So not exactly ideal conditions for the dogs. And he said that it was also causing some problems with their paws. They'd be scraping up against some of these cages, and it just wasn't a very suitable environment for a dog that's about to go out onto a racing track.
And so part of this handover document, I don't even know if we can call it that, but part of this document is about the conditions and the welfare of the animals. But from what I understand, you've told me there was another part about the industry at large, right?
Yeah, so the second big part of his report looked at what's known as rehoming rates.
What's rehoming?
So that's either when you adopt out a dog to go live with a family or to go live in a residential property, or if the dog stays on an owner's property itself. So basically where the dog goes to live for the rest of its life. So before a greyhound can be adopted, though, it needs to be desexed. And this is something that Greyhound Racing New South Wales actually pays owners to do as an incentive. So they cover that cost. And so what Alex Britton noted was he believed that the numbers of rehomed dogs, as reported by Greyhound Racing New South Wales, were grossly exaggerated. So, for instance, he pointed to the figures in 2023. So the body had said that 2,200 dogs had been rehomed. But then the regulator, he pointed out a gap because the regulator had said that 1,650 dogs had been rehomed in that year. So that's about a 550 dog gap. And he alleges that this gap comes from the racing body counting desexed dogs as rehomed dogs. But that's not necessarily the case, because he says in reality, owners will either keep the dogs or pay to send them to these boarding shelters where they live out what he says is a miserable post-racing lives in these industrial-sized kennels. So think of those massive cages with not much room to move on big properties, and that's where all these greyhounds apparently are being sent to live out the rest of their lives.
So obviously this is just one individual who has alleged a number of wrongdoings on behalf of this industry. How has the racing body responded to all of this? Obviously, we need to go over what their response is in this situation.
The CEO of Greyhound Racing New South Wales, Rob McCauley, resigned on Tuesday after the media started reporting on the accusations. In his resignation statement, he defended the industry as a key source of income and jobs and prosperity for communities right across New South Wales. And in a statement that was sent to the Daily Aus, Greyhound Racing New South Wales said it takes, quote, any claims or concern related to animal welfare or the integrity of our rehoming programs very seriously. And all 7 members of the racing board have been given until today, Friday, to show cause to the Minister for Racing as to why they also shouldn't lose their jobs.
Wow. Very strong kind of follow-on effects there.
As far as an organisation being held responsible and accountable, this
almost immediately.
Absolutely.
Right. And so what happens to the industry? I mean, clearly there have been quite immediate consequences for Greyhound Racing New South Wales, but what happens to the industry at large? Do you think it'll be banned?
So the Premier, Chris Minns, was asked this very question the other day about whether the industry at large would be banned, which is what former Premier Mike Baird tried to do back in 2016.
Look, we're not going to shut down the industry, but we do take this report seriously.
The regulator also said it's going to launch an investigation, but the Greens and the Animal Justice Party say an inquiry won't be enough. I spoke with Upper House Greens MP Abigail Boyd, who said she thinks these revelations could be a repeat of what that Four Corners episode back in 2015 triggered.
I'm hoping that people really begin to understand that this is a cruel, cruel industry that's seeing thousands of dogs die and be injured and be left for dead every single year.
This doesn't feel like a party-specific issue. We have had a Labor government here respond. But previously, as you said, Mike Baird, who was a coalition premier, tried to ban the industry. What have we heard from the coalition in New South Wales?
A spokesperson for the Shadow Racing Minister, Kevin Anderson, told the Daily Aus that he is monitoring the situation closely, but didn't go into any further details. So there's plenty of developments to still come to light. It's a bit uncertain at the moment what's going to happen with the board. We're going to find out a bit more today, I believe, because that's the deadline that was given to the board to show cause why they shouldn't be let go, and what is going to happen more broadly with greyhound racing in New South Wales.
Harry, thanks so much for explaining that, and thank you for listening to another week of the Daily Aus. If you learnt something, please send it to a friend. It is the way that people find out about our podcast and certainly about the Daily Aus more generally. We'll be back again on Monday morning, but have a fabulous weekend.